Greetings, friends of liberty. I confess to counting myself astonished when we examine the extraordinary English public schools, that is, those schools accepting anyone from the public, but which are, of course, funded by private funds and are privately owned, that anyone would imagine that a state school could compare. I mean, is anything other than inferior. Shall I list some examples without equal or peer in the realm? Example number 1, Eton. Established in 1440, Eton, known as the nurse of England's statesmen, boasts some of the finest English graduates, bar none. Old Etonians include in the military the extraordinary up-and-coming aide-de-camp to the present Lord of Ireland, Arthur Wellesley. In government, the former Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, though it must be admitted, he, as a consequence of his experience, had Pitt the Younger educated at home. In science, Robert Boyle, chemist and physicist extraordinaire, and, of course, in fashion, that emerging wit and dandy, Beau Brummel, now all of 15 years. Example number 2, Harrow. Established in 1572, Harrow's alumni comprise a list of legends. Barrister Spencer Percival, Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, who loves marbles, so much I fear shall land him in no end of trouble, General John Hodgson, and Francis Rawdon Hastings, the first Marquess of Hastings. And example number 3, Westminster School. This, established sometime in the 14th century, is notable for alumnus John Locke and for having the highest percentage of graduates proceeding to Oxford and Cambridge. I shan't detain you with further examples, but they would include Winchester, Rugby, Shrewsbury, and Charterhouse. Really, can any state school compare? Certainly neither in scholarship nor sportsmanship. Now, if we turn away from the 18th century and to the issue of how state schools, that is, public education in its modern form, originated in your United States of America, we find today a writer who's occupied himself at length with just that question. Samuel Blumenfeld, educator and historian of education, describes in Is Public Education Necessary? How American governmental education, A, creating unnecessary societal and personal conflict by throwing Catholics, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, liberal, and conservative pupils all together, ignoring their educational preferences and that of their parents who pay for their education. B, damaging many children severely by being unwilling to discipline violent and disruptive classmates, thus preventing children who desperately want and need to learn, and which learning will potentially determine the whole course of their lives, from learning. C, diagnosing many children who become restless and bored because they're at a pathetic public school as suffering from attention deficit disorder and drugging them as a consequence. D, allowing public teachers' unions, whose primary concern is not the welfare and education of children, but their own income and leisure, to dominate the administration and running of schools, they preventing principals and headmasters from utilizing their own judgment to improve the schools while deliberately preventing the firing of bad teachers. E, costing on average twice as much as an equivalent private education would. F, failing to even teach the most proven and successful way of reading, phonics, but instead constantly trying to reintroduce the method of whole word reading. This catastrophe has happened in numerous instances in both the US and UK. G, attempting to constantly indoctrinate children with ideologies ranging from trans, queer, anti-white, pro-black, radical green, socialist, pro-Muslim, and anti-Semitic. and H, centralizing school districts and creating large and impersonal mega schools, thus destroying the many smaller schools which previously existed and making transportation to the school more difficult. How this all came to pass in the United States. He starts his history with the religious changes of the Reformation, arguing that many European governments set up public education because drawing closer to God, and thus salvation, depended on knowing God's word, which is in the Bible, which meant you had to be able to read it. The Puritans, who initially settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were of course Calvinists and followed Calvin in believing that one primary purpose of government was to ensure that no idolatry, no blasphemy against the name of God, break out and be disseminated among the people. Of course, the Puritans took their enforcement of conformity seriously, hanging 4 dissenting Quakers on Boston Common from 1659 to 1661. But a better way to ensure conformity to religious doctrine long-term was simply by indoctrinating children with the Word of God. And so, at least partly for this reason, the following school code was enacted in 1647. It being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep man from the knowledge of the Scriptures, it is therefore ordered by this court that every township, after the Lord has increased them to 50 householders, shall then appoint one within their town to teach all such children to write and read, whose wages shall be paid either by the parents or masters of such children or by the inhabitants in general. Thus, during colonial times, not only did the Puritans in 1636 tax the population a year's worth of taxes and give that money to Harvard, but also attempted to enforce education at the primary level. As time passed, however, the more tolerant English administrators of the Mass Bay Colony thankfully revoked the Puritans' charter, which spelled the legal end to the Bible Commonwealth. And that meant that the citizenry was freer not to obey these compulsory laws despite occasional attempts to fine them for their disobedience. As he says, by 1720, Boston had far more private schools than public ones, and by the close of the American Revolution, many towns had no public schools at all. The result was one of the more literate societies in the Western world, with adult male literacy in the American colonies ranging from 70 to 100%. And in Massachusetts, as in Pennsylvania, citizens understood that a public system was extraneous, since aid could just be granted directly to a poor student to go to a private school. Nowadays, that would be called a voucher, which meant then as now that there was zero justification for starting a whole public system. In the same way, we don't need to create government cafeterias just because a few parents neglect to feed their children properly. In 1789, with the influence of John and Samuel Adams and other Harvard-educated Brahmins, who in accordance with their Puritan roots believed in public education, Massachusetts legislatures decided to reinstate the common school system. The Boston version of this was implemented by the Education Act of 1789. Nonetheless, given how free America was politically and economically, it was not surprising that, apart from New England, where tax-supported schools existed under state law, the United States from 1789 to 1835 had a completely laissez-faire system of education, with private schools for the poor being funded by philanthropists and others. In Philadelphia, an entire system of charity schools was created around the William Penn Charter School, founded by Quakers in 1701. Its support came from rents, gifts, legacies, and fees, but instruction for the poor was always free. Back in Boston, as Massachusetts entered the 19th century, Harvardians and other graduates more and more began traveling across the Atlantic to do their postgraduate work. So, for example, Edward Everett, George Ticknor, Joseph Cogswell, and George Bancroft studied in Germany, with Everett on return becoming the greatest classical scholar in America, Ticknor the father of modern language study, Cogswell the first great American librarian, and Bancroft the first great American historian. All these Harvard Unitarians, like the earlier Puritans, believed in the necessity of public education, and when in Europe, saw that both the newly created Dutch and Prussian systems had extensive powers to compel youngsters to go to school. In England, too, there was the utopian dreamer and collectivist Robert Owen, who complemented his socialism with a public system of indoctrination, starting already at the age of 2. Owen said, "It follows that every state, to be well governed, ought to direct its chief attention to the formation of character, and the best governed state will be that which shall possess the best national system of education." By 1817, Boston elites began considering how they might start the same kind of coercive system in Massachusetts. To further investigate the issue, the Boston School Committee appointed a subcommittee chaired by the distinguished architect Charles Bulfinch to conduct a survey. That survey found that no less than 96% of Boston school-age children were already in school, with about a third, 2,365 in public, 3,767 in private, and 365 in charity schools. And only 283 kids in the whole city of 40,000 were not in school, which doesn't exclude the possibility of their being educated at home. So Bulfinch pointed out that A, public schooling thus obviously wasn't necessary, since you could just give money to a poor family so they could send their child to an existing private school, and B, it was morally responsible for parents to pay for their own children's education, since it ought never to be forgotten that the office of instruction belongs to parents. In other words, society isn't legally responsible for your child. You are. Nonetheless, against Bulfinch's advice, a small public system was started, despite the fact that private schooling and academies continue to grow in popularity given their natural superiority. As Blumenfeld says, the private schools are more efficiently organized, provided better instruction, pupil supervision, and social atmosphere. They were less crowded and offered a more practical curriculum. So these Harvardians that had gone to Europe or admired the Prussian system and were fighting to destroy private schools by creating their own K-12 monopoly realized that schools of education, to train teachers, could create cadres of public school teachers who would then constitute a partial voting bloc and lobby for the continuance of the public system, just like modern teachers' unions. As James Carter, another Harvardian, wrote, an institution for the education of teachers would form a very important part, because an institution for this purpose would become, by its influence on society, and particularly on the young, an engine to sway the public sentiment, the public morals, and the public religion more powerful than any other in the possession of government. Sounds very German, very authoritarian, very Harvard. As time went on, communists, too, being the totalitarians they are, also expressed their support. And so Robert Owen's son, Robert Dale Owen, would, speaking in 1832, praise ancient Sparta and its teaching methods. He said, "Who doubts the omnipotence of national education? Let him read of Sparta and learn how her infant citizens were trained. Let us learn of Lycurgus, of him who molded a nation's character to his will." So here he is praising Spartan brainwashing techniques and ignoring that further north, Athens, with its educational freedom, was creating perhaps the most brilliant civilization of the ancient world. It should be noted, incidentally, that the power of higher education today to distribute its many bad ideas, indoctrinating young people with its ideologies, is much greater, given that there are about 15 million American undergraduates today, but that there would be only about 100,000 if the same percentage of the population were in college now as were back then. By 1835, largely through the untiring work of Josiah Holbrook, born in Connecticut and educated at Yale, the educators of America had been organized into a solid body of support for public education. In state after state, legislatures began to establish the foundations of tax-supported public educational systems. Already in 1833, a report by Victor Cousin, a French philosopher who traveled to Germany, studied at the University of Göttingen, and observed German compulsory education was translated. His report became influential in the U.S. and was distributed widely among educators at taxpayers' expense. In the report, Cousin compared educational enrollment to military conscription, saying, "I am convinced the time will come when popular education will be equally recognized, as military conscription is, as a social duty imperative on all for the sake of all." Notice the coercion and collectivism. Other American educators, such as Alexander Bacci, great-grandson of Benjamin Franklin, also went to Prussia and then, in his case, after returning, spent 3 years reorganizing the public schools of Philadelphia. Now enter Horace Mann, the person most responsible for bringing public ed in its present bureaucratic, centralized, property tax-funded form to America. Mann, as a youngster, had given up the strict Calvinism of his youth and adopted the less fundamentalist Unitarianism. Instead of going to Harvard or Yale, he instead went to Brown in Rhode Island upon graduation, studying to be a lawyer. Starting his practice in Dedham, Massachusetts, he quickly learned how politics works. Mann, along with the sixth president of the U.S., John Quincy Adams, like many Republicans, was a believer in bigger government and crony capitalism. He's supporting government subsidies to railroads and also supporting prohibitionist legislation in curtailing the rights of drinkers and grog shops to sell alcohol. When Edward Everett, another do-gooding Harvard graduate, became Massachusetts governor in 1835, he got a law passed that created an 8-man state board of education to promote and oversee the public schools, and appointed Mann as its head. Upon accepting the post and understanding the strong spirit of the Commonwealth against his inferior public system, Mann said that "I am ready to undergo the hardships and privations to which I must be subjected, and to encounter the jealousy, misrepresentation, and the prejudice almost certain to arise. I am ready to meet them in the spirit of a martyr, all in the service of coercing others educationally." Mann then proceeded in the coming years to tour the state and then make annual reports to the Board of Education, in which he often noted how bad public schools were, but then claimed that A, a stricter enforcement of the compulsory attendance, B, with more money for libraries of approved books, and C, more money for the training and salaries of public teachers would improve their conditions. However, the next Massachusetts governor, Marcus Morton, understood the nature of public schools and set up a committee to counter Mann's influence. That committee noted not only the lack of true diversity in public schools, but also rejected Mann's establishing of teacher training institutes, saying that not only had the private sector supplied our own schools with competent teachers, but also annually furnished hundreds to the West and the South. The committee concluded by calling Mann's proposed system a dangerous precedent, greatly to be feared, that any attempt to force all our schools and all our teachers upon one model would destroy all competition and the spirit of improvement itself, which is largely what has exactly happened in the U.S. subsequently, as Mann's coercive system of schooling unfortunately getting more and more legislative and political support. Finally, with lots of Catholic immigrants starting to come to America and Massachusetts, the question arose as to how public education could possibly teach students of different religions. The answer, of course, is that it can't do that well, and that only private education can, since it doesn't take the taxpayers' money, but instead lets parents spend their money on the type of religious or non-religious education they want. Mann and his supporters believed the opposite, saying that anyone who wants the destruction of our public schools is a traitor to the cause of liberty and equality. So how was religion handled by Mann's schools? What was eventually fashioned was a bland public Protestant system that didn't much represent any religious creed or moral creed at all. at which point the Catholics naturally started their own parochial schools, which, for much of subsequent American history, on average, cost half the price while giving an equivalent or better education. Here, Blumenthal's history ends, the public system having achieved a strong foothold in an otherwise free America, at which point, by continuing to take the taxpayers' money to constantly expand, simply prevented many private schools from being patronized, since most parents couldn't pay twice to educate their children. In conclusion, I'd give this an A-, B+. Blumenfeld gives an accurate recounting of the initial ideological and economic factors that allowed inferior state education to drive out the superior and more affordable private education. However, sometimes being a religious person, he attributes to atheism tendencies that it doesn't possess. For example, he says, pantheists laid the foundation for the tyrannical total state, which was to develop after World War I, usually under the dictatorship of a great man. This is clearly false. Spinoza, the philosopher, for example, was a pantheist, but believed in democracy and liberal forms of government. Very happy for my part that you Americans are now rediscovering the value of freedom in lower education, as is exemplified by your school choice movement, powerful and growing as a result of parents having seen the disastrous treatment by public schools of children during COVID. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.